Hi everyone. In this next video we're going to build the base for the outdoor kitchen's workbench. Originally I wanted to build this out of steel, but as I've got all the woodworking equipment, we figured in the short term anyway we'll build a wooden base and just live with that for the next couple of years. In general, timber outdoor furniture here doesn't last terribly long. It's very damp over the winter, so things tend to rot and disappear fairly quickly. So I'm hoping we'll get 2 or 3 good years out of it, and at some point in the future we'll figure out how to do welding and put together a nice steel base. In the meantime, we'll get on with a wooden one. What I wanted to do in this video though is something a little different. I'm not going to plane any of the wood, I'm not going to joint any of the wood. I am going to use the domino, but I'm going to use the wood as picked up from the hardware store. I picked up 2 different types of, or 2 different shapes. For the legs, I've got some square wood, and you can see that the edges have been rounded in the factory. It's 44 by 44 millimeters. For the rails, between the legs, I've got 27 by 44 millimeter wood. I'm going to cut these to length with the table saw so I get consistency, but you could do that in many different ways. I will use the table saw, you could use a drop saw, you could use a sliding compound miter saw, you could use a hand saw. It doesn't really matter so long as things are pretty much the same length, you know, within a millimeter here or there. I'm going to use the domino to joint it. For the joints, I should say. Again, the domino creates, you know, floating mortise and tenon joints. You could use traditional joinery, mortise and tenon joints. You could use dowels. I don't think biscuits would really work. I suppose you could use pocket holes. I'm just not sure if you'd get the requisite strength and durability. So I'm going to use the domino. I'm going to use reference edges. That is to say, I'm going to identify edges on every piece of wood that I cut. And I'm going to use the domino's inbuilt functionality, these little pins here and here, that give me a distance from where the bit comes through to do the cut. So I'm going to end up with consistent distances every time I plunge. So long as I know which edge is up, or which end is up, and which edge is facing, let's say, to the front or the back, and I'm consistently using the same reference edge every time I make a cut, when I put it all together, it should all be pretty square, right? Back on topic, the fixed depth. So I know I've got a distance from my front to the wall that is fixed. That distance is what I'm going to use when I create all my leg elements. So when I put them together, from the 2 sides here and the 2 sides here, when I squeeze 2 of them together in a clamp, I know that that distance should be the same. So I can build a template that makes this square. I can build a square piece of wood, or cut a square piece of wood that holds it square. So when I glue it vertically and clamp it down, I can make sure I'm not in some sort of strange off square shape. I can make sure it's square because I know that this distance is fixed. So you'll see me do that as well. So this is a project that pretty much you can do pretty much with anything you have. Simple dowel joints, simple hand saw. I think in the end we'll get within 1 or 2 millimeters, and that's totally fine for this sort of application. Let's get going. So the first thing I'm doing is just rough cutting the wood for the legs. Then I'm going to cut these to exactly 90 centimeters. There are 10 legs. 90 centimeters will give us a bench top height of around about 95 centimeters, which is what we have in the house, and that's what we like to work with. In the next video you'll see the bench top being made, and each leg has a foot. So I think 90, the height of the foot and the thickness of the bench, and we should end up around 95. So we've cut 10 legs. Next thing I want to do is put a hole dead center at the bottom of each leg for the feet to go into. So I'm making a little jig to help me get that hole in each leg perfectly in line with the length of the leg itself. Just drill through this, make sure it's deep enough, and repeat 10 times. Putting the hole in the bottom of the legs, of course, has now given us a top. So we have 10 holes and 10 legs, and we know which end is which at this moment. So then I moved on and cut each of the rails according to the planning. On the left side, I wanted a width that dictated the length of each of these rails, and then on the right hand side the same thing. So we end up with a series of identical pieces, and then we have to get on and start to connect them. I think it was around about 76 dominoes. Here I'm doing what I described in the preamble. I'm marking a side on each piece so that I always have a reference edge to use for the domino. So regardless of which end I'm putting a domino into, I know which side to use as the reference. Quickly setting up the domino and starting with the first cut. It's really just a matter of repeating this several times for each of the 10 legs. Then for each of the rails, we're putting a slot for the dominoes in each end. And this is really where the reference edge is, again, very important. So that you are cutting always from the left, and then when you flip it around, you are cutting always from the right. So it's very important to mark a reference edge. When all that is done, you can start to assemble each piece. There are 5 of these, a section of bench on the left and a section of bench on the right, twice as long as the one on the left, requiring 3 legs. And then between the 2 sections, I want to put a sink. So this process was repeated 5 times. Now I need to start to join each of those 5 pieces together. And this is what I talked about a little bit in the preamble at the beginning. So each of these individual pieces is square. Squaring them up to one another is a different matter. So I join the 2 together, and I know that the width of each one is identical. So I'm able to cut a piece of MDF out to exactly that width and make sure that each leg lines up exactly to the side of that MDF board. So if I clamp that there and do a similar thing at the other end, then I know that I'm square to the MDF. It got a little more tricky when I started to put the second story on. So the bottom one, of course, has been glued up and is stable. Then the top one had to be added and squared to the bottom. This was a little bit of a fingers crossed exercise, but I used exactly the same template and squared it. The same at the other end. And you can see it wobbling in the other direction in the vertical plane. But I figured out that just a square clamped like this was enough to hold it. Then I just did a quick check that the diagonals were identical in both directions, and they were, so it was fine. And yeah, as you can see, it's managed to work out quite well. So it was a coat of undercoat paint, and then we just had decided to use a colour that's called anthracite, which is effectively just a very, very dark grey bordering on black. The next job, which was a little fiddly, is just to get it all square and plumb. The 2 units, doing this again, I think I would have designed it slightly differently. As you can see, there's 2 independent units that have to be sort of glued and clamped together. Ideally, would have done this as you'd get with a regular kitchen unit and had 3 sections to be bolted together. So it's in this section here that the sink will sit. And once this is done, I can move on. The tiles that you can see, the lines of the tiles there, are not square to the wall. So once this is done and situated roughly, I moved on and just started making measurements for the concrete bench surface. Please subscribe to the channel. In the next video, we'll be making the molds for the bench tops.